Why do you not just disappear? The crystal champagne flute shattered against the mahogany doorframe, missing my head by mere inches. My own sister screamed that I was ruining her perfect life while her husband stood by with a condescending smirk. My parents did not stop her. In fact, they agreed. I did not scream back. I simply dropped the master financial ledger in the middle of their expensive dinner and walked out into the night. 2 years later, my phone lit up with 22 missed calls from the family that threw me away. They were about to lose everything, and the sister who wished I would disappear suddenly needed me to save her from federal prison. My name is Zoe. I am 35 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant. Before I continue my story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, while the golden child got away with everything, hit the like button and subscribe. You will want to hear exactly how I handled the ultimate betrayal. The evening began at one of the most exclusive country clubs in Atlanta. We were gathered to celebrate the third wedding anniversary of my younger sister Brianna and her husband Connor. The private dining room was draped in white silk and gold accents, reflecting the exact image Brianna had spent her entire life cultivating. At 33, Brianna was the undisputed golden child of our family. She wore a stunning designer gown that cost more than my first car, and her diamond ring caught the light every time she reached for her wine glass. Connor sat beside her, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He was a slick-talking venture capitalist whose white family supposedly came from old money. His parents sat across from me, exuding a quiet judgment that made the air in the room feel thick and suffocating. For years, our family owned a highly successful upscale Southern restaurant. It was the crown jewel of my parents' legacy. My father, Reverend Thomas, used his influence in the church community to build a massive, loyal clientele. My mother, Vivian, acted as the hostess, floating through the dining room in her Sunday best, making sure everyone who was anyone felt important. I was the silent engine keeping the machine running. As a certified public accountant, I handled all the books, the payroll, and the tax filings for the restaurant without ever asking for a dime in return. It was my duty as the eldest daughter. But the peace shattered when the IRS froze the restaurant accounts earlier that week. The truth was simple but devastating. Connor had convinced my parents to give him administrative access to the business accounts, claiming he could optimize their investments. Instead, he drained $400,000 to fund his failing cryptocurrency startup. When the federal notices arrived, Connor panicked. He knew his wealthy parents would cut him off if they found out he was actually broke and gambling with his in-laws' money. So he and Brianna hatched a plan. They decided to blame the quiet, dependable sister. "Look, Zoe, you messed up the restaurant books," Connor said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "It happens. But to let the IRS freeze the accounts on the week of our anniversary is unacceptable. You are making Brianna look foolish in front of my family." I stared at him. I looked at the 6 faces staring back at me. Connor's parents looked at me with open disgust, clearly believing the narrative that I was the incompetent sister riding on the coattails of their successful son. Brianna's face was flushed with anger. She had just thrown the glass, and the spilled champagne was still dripping down the expensive wallpaper. I turned my gaze to my parents, expecting them to intervene. I expected my father, a man who preached about truth and integrity every Sunday, to stand up and tell the truth. Instead, my mother, Vivian, rushed past me. She did not ask if the shattered glass had cut my face. She pulled a silk napkin from the table and began dabbing at Brianna's perfectly contoured cheek, cooing and hushing her as if she were a toddler. "Brianna." "Sweetheart, your blood pressure," Vivian murmured. "Do not let this upset you on your special night." Then my father cleared his throat. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the crisp white tablecloth, and used his heavy Sunday pulpit voice. The voice he used when he wanted the entire congregation to submit to his authority. "Fix it, Zoe," he commanded. "Take the penalty, Admit to the tax board that you made an accounting error. Your sister marriage cannot handle this kind of financial stress. We need to present a united front for Connor family. The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the air. They were asking me to risk my CPA license, my career, and my freedom to protect a man who had stolen almost $500,000 from our family legacy. They were willing to sacrifice my entire livelihood just so Brianna could continue playing the role of a wealthy socialite. My mother looked up from comforting Brianna and shot me a glaring look. Be a team player, Zoe, she snapped. You are single. You do not have a family of your own to worry about. Connor has investors watching him. Just take the blame gracefully so we can move past this. You have always been so selfish when it comes to your sister. Selfish. The word echoed in my mind. I thought about the late nights I spent auditing the restaurant inventory while Brianna was vacationing in Tulum. I thought about the times I paid the utility bills for the church out of my own pocket because my father had overspent on lavish choir robes. I was the one who held the foundation together while they decorated the house, and now they wanted to bury me under the rubble. Connor smirked, picking up his fork to cut into his roasted duck. He truly believed he had won. He believed that the dynamic of our family was so rigidly set that I would simply bow my head and absorb the blow as I had done my entire life. He thought my silence was submission. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. The burning sensation in my chest crystallized into pure, absolute clarity. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the heavy-bound master ledger for the restaurant. It contained every bank statement, every wire transfer, and every forged authorization Connor had submitted to the bank. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress. I walked over to Connor, end of the table. He looked up, a flicker of confusion crossing his arrogant face. Without a single word, I dropped the heavy ledger directly into the center of his plate. Gravy and duck fat splattered all over his pristine white shirt and the expensive tablecloth. "Hey," Connor shouted, jumping back and knocking his chair over. "What is wrong with you? I am not fixing anything," I said, my voice dead calm and perfectly steady. "The evidence of every dollar you stole is in that book. Explain it to the IRS yourself." My father stood up, his face turning a deep shade of purple. "Zoe, Elise, do not walk away from this table," he bellowed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass key to the family home, the house I had helped pay the mortgage on for the last 5 years. I tossed it onto the table where it clattered against the fine crystal. "Brianna wanted me to disappear," I said, looking directly into my mother's shocked eyes. "Consider her wish granted." I turned around and walked out of the private dining room. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of Brianna screaming and Connor cursing. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out into the country club parking lot. I did not look back. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the only family I had ever known. I initiated an immediate and absolute no-contact rule. I changed my phone number, I moved my financial accounts, and I relocated to Chicago to build my own forensic accounting firm. I thought I was done with them forever. I thought the severed ties would finally give me peace. I was wrong. 2 years later, they would drag me back into their mess. But this time, I would not be the scapegoat. I would be the architect of their downfall. The dining room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence after Connor threw his baseless accusation at me. The spilled champagne from the glass Brianna had hurled was still pooling on the rich mahogany floor, but nobody was looking at the mess. Every pair of eyes in that private country club room was fixed on me. I stood there feeling the familiar weight of being the family scapegoat pressing down on my shoulders. I waited for the inevitable defense that any normal parents would offer their child. I waited for my father to use his booming voice to demand the truth. I waited for my mother to rush over and check if the flying crystal had cut my face. Neither of those things happened. Instead, my mother Vivian let out a soft, dramatic gasp and rushed straight toward Brianna. She completely bypassed me, her silk dress brushing against my leg as she hurried to comfort the sister who had just committed an act of violence. Vivian pulled a monogrammed napkin from the table and began dabbing at Brianna's perfectly dry face. My mother murmured soothing words telling Brianna to breathe and to remember her blood pressure. She treated a 33-year-old woman throwing a violent tantrum like a fragile porcelain doll that had just been victimized. It was the same dynamic I had endured since childhood. Brianna could burn the house down, and my mother would blame me for handing her the matches. I shifted my gaze to my father, Reverend Thomas. He was sitting at the head of the table, a position he demanded in every setting. He had built his entire identity around being the moral compass of his community. His sermons were heavily attended, and he rubbed shoulders with local politicians and wealthy business owners. Yet in his own family, he was a coward who worshipped at the altar of social standing. Right now, his eyes were darting nervously toward Connor parents, who sat frozen on the other side of the table. They were wealthy, white, and well-connected in high society. My father had spent the last 3 years bending over backward to prove that our family was worthy of their presence. The thought of them witnessing a financial scandal involving his restaurant was clearly tearing him apart. Thomas cleared his throat. The sound echoed of the quiet room, signaling that the Reverend was about to deliver a verdict. He folded his hands tightly on the table and looked at me with an expression completely devoid of paternal warmth. His eyes were cold, calculating, and deeply unfair. "Zoe," he began, his voice dropping an octave into that practiced authoritative tone he used to reprimand sinners from the pulpit. "We are all adults here. There is no need for this to escalate into a scene. We have guests." He gestured subtly toward Connor parents who were watching the spectacle with thinly veiled disgust. My father was actually more concerned about their judgment than the fact that my brother-in-law had just stolen $400,000 and blamed it on me. "The restaurant is the pillar of our community," my father continued. "It represents the hard work and the respectable image of our family. If the IRS continues to freeze those accounts, it will become public knowledge. The church deacons will hear about it. The local papers will write about it. We cannot afford that kind of scrutiny right now. Connor has investors looking at his new technology firm. A scandal would ruin his funding." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I knew exactly where he was going with this, but hearing him lay the groundwork for my execution was still a profound shock to the system. Therefore, my father said, leaning forward, so his face was illuminated by the crystal chandelier above, "You need to take responsibility for this accounting error. You need to contact the federal tax board tomorrow morning and formally admit that you mismanaged the funds. We will pay the penalty fees quietly, but you must put it on your professional record that the missing money was a result of your negligence." I stared at him, unable to process the magnitude of his demand. He was not just asking me to take the blame for a broken vase or a dented car bumper. He was demanding that I commit career suicide. As a certified public accountant, my entire livelihood depended on my professional integrity. Admitting to gross financial negligence involving hundreds of thousands of dollars would guarantee that my license would be revoked. I would lose my clients and my reputation. I would never work in finance again. "You are asking me to destroy my career," I said, my voice remarkably steady, despite the storm raging inside me. "You know Connor took that money. You know he diverted it to his failing startup. And you want me to lie to the federal government and lose my CPA license so he does not have to face the consequences of his own theft." Before my father could answer, my mother spun around from where she was coddling Brianna. Her eyes flashed with the kind of indignant anger she reserved only for me. "Do not speak to your father with that tone," Vivian snapped, her voice sharp and biting. "You are always so selfish, Zoe. Always thinking about your own little world while your sister is trying to build a family. You are a single woman. You do not have a husband to support or children to feed. You can easily find a job somewhere else, maybe do bookkeeping for a small shop. But Connor has a reputation to uphold. His family name carries weight." The sheer audacity of her words felt like a physical blow. She was reducing my entire life of hard work, late nights, studying, and professional achievements to a disposable hobby. I had built my career from the ground up without a single dollar of their help. I paid for my own college tuition by working double shifts while they bought Brianna a luxury car for her graduation. To my mother, my success was meaningless because I was not married to a wealthy man. I was just a utility, a tool to be used and discarded to ensure Brianna comfort. Brianna chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. It is the least you could do, Zoe. You have been jealous of my marriage since day one. You purposely messed up the books just to sabotage my anniversary week. Everyone knows it. Just sign the confession and stop being such a bitter person. I looked at Connor, who was trying to hide a triumphant smile behind his wineglass. He knew he had won the lottery with my family. He had found a group of people so desperate to maintain the illusion of high society acceptance that they would eagerly throw their own flesh and blood into the fire to protect a lying thief. My father nodded in agreement with Brianna, as if her absurd logic was the gospel truth. It is settled then, my father said, entirely dismissing my presence as a human being with rights. I will have the lawyer draft the confession letter tonight. You will sign it tomorrow morning before you go to work. If you refuse, you will no longer be welcome in our home or our congregation. You will be completely cut off. They really believed that the threat of losing them would break me. They had spent 35 years conditioning me to crave their approval, to work tirelessly behind the scenes for scraps of affection. They thought I would crumble at the thought of being exiled from the family. They fundamentally misunderstood who I had become. The toxic dynamics that had governed my childhood were laid bare in that dining room, and the final thread of obligation I felt toward them snapped completely. I did not feel fear or sorrow. I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. The pulpit had made its decree, but I was no longer a member of their congregation. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back against the thick carpet of the private dining room. The scraping sound cut through the tense silence. My mother flinched, expecting an apology. My father leaned back, crossing his arms, expecting submission. Connor simply smirked, taking a sip of his wine, confident that he had successfully manipulated the entire room. They were all waiting for me to break down, to cry, or to beg for their understanding. I did none of those things. The fear that had kept me tethered to them for 35 years was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. I reached into my structured leather tote bag. My fingers brushed past my wallet and wrapped around the thick spine of the restaurant master ledger. I had spent 70 hours over the past 4 days meticulously auditing every single transaction. I had highlighted every unauthorized wire transfer Connor had made. I had flagged every fake invoice he created to funnel money into his failing crypto startup. I pulled the heavy book out and held it in both hands. The leather cover was worn, a testament to the years I had spent keeping my family business afloat while they took all the credit. "What are you doing?" my father demanded, his pastoral authority wavering just a fraction. "Sit down, Zoe. We are not finished discussing your consequences." "We are absolutely finished," I said. My voice did not shake. It rang out clear and steady in the silent room. I walked around the edge of the large circular table, stopping right behind Connor's chair. He stiffened, turning his head to look up at me. His smirk faltered when he saw the dead expression in my eyes. Without hesitating, I lifted the heavy ledger and dropped it directly onto the center of the table, right on top of the massive silver platter holding the roasted duck. The impact was loud. Gravy duck fat and cranberry glaze splattered everywhere. Dark, greasy spots bloomed across Connor's pristine white shirt. The heavy book crushed the perfectly arranged garnish, sinking into the ruined meal. "Are you crazy?" Connor shouted, jumping out of his chair and frantically wiping at his expensive suit. He looked at the ruined fabric and then glared at me with pure hatred. "You stupid girl, look what you did. You need to fix this mess right now. You need to call the IRS tomorrow and fix my accounts." I looked at him and then pointed down at the gravy-soaked ledger. "The mess is all yours, Connor," I replied evenly. "Every single dollar you stole from my parents is documented in those pages, every offshore transfer and every forged signature. I am not calling the IRS. I am not signing a confession. If you want to stay out of federal prison, I suggest you find a very good lawyer." My mother gasped, covering her mouth in horror. Brianna's face drained of color as she stared at the ledger sitting in the ruined dinner. For the first time all evening, she was completely speechless. Zoe, Elise. My father bellowed, rising to his feet and slamming his fist on the table. You will not disrespect this family. You will not walk away from your responsibilities. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the heavy brass key to the family home. It was the house I had grown up in. The house where I had paid the property taxes for the last 5 years, because my father preferred to spend his money on custom-tailored suits and golf club memberships. I held the key up, letting it catch the light from the chandelier overhead. I have no responsibilities here anymore, I said. I looked directly at Brianna, who was still staring at me in shock. Earlier tonight, you screamed at me to just disappear. You told me I was ruining your perfect life. I opened my hand and let the brass key drop. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, metallic clatter that echoed through the room. Consider your wish granted, I told her. I am disappearing. Do not ever contact me again. I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. Connor yelled after me, his voice cracking with sudden panic as the reality of the situation finally hit him. He shouted that I could not do this, that they would sue me, that he would ruin my reputation. My father commanded me to stop in the name of God and family. I did not even break my stride. I pushed the doors open and walked out of the dining room, leaving their shouts trapped behind me. The country club lobby was quiet and peaceful. The soft jazz playing through the overhead speakers felt like a stark contrast to the war zone I had just left. I nodded politely to the valet as I handed him my ticket. When my car was brought around, I tipped him generously, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. The moment the engine purred to life, I pulled my phone from my purse. I did not wait until I got home to cut the cord. I did it right there in the parking lot under the glow of the streetlights. I opened my banking app and instantly removed myself as a guarantor on the family credit accounts. I drafted a swift 2-sentence email to the restaurant bank, formally resigning as their certified public accountant and revoking all my authorizations. Finally, I opened my contacts. I blocked my father. I blocked my mother. I blocked Brianna. I blocked Connor. I deleted their numbers from my phone entirely. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the country club gates. As I merged onto the highway, the city lights of Atlanta blurred past my windows. For the first time in my life, my chest did not feel tight with anxiety about what my family would think of me. I did not feel the crushing weight of their expectations or the sting of their constant rejection. I felt light. I felt powerful. That night, I packed my apartment. Within 2 weeks, I had broken my lease, accepted a lucrative contract in Chicago, and left Georgia completely. I spent the next 2 years building my own life from the ground up. I poured all my energy into launching my own forensic accounting firm, specializing in corporate fraud. I surrounded myself with people who valued my brilliance instead of exploiting it. I met a man named Elijah who loved me fiercely and showed me what a real partnership looked like. I was thriving. I was finally free. Or so I thought. Because toxic families do not just let their scapegoats escape that easily. They wait until they have burned their own house down, and then they come looking for the person who always carried the water. 2 years of perfect silence were about to end. I had built a fortress, but the people who taught me how to survive were about to test its walls. The next 2 years were a masterclass in survival and reinvention. I arrived in Chicago with 2 suitcases, a bruised ego, and a burning desire to build an empire that no one could ever take away from me. The biting wind of Lake Michigan was a welcome shock to my system. It kept me awake during the long nights I spent drafting business plans and cold calling potential clients from a cramped studio apartment in the South Loop. I poured every ounce of my frustration into my work. When I was not auditing financial records, I was networking at corporate seminars, proving my worth in rooms full of men who underestimated me. Within 6 months, my forensic accounting firm was officially licensed and operational. I specialized in untangling corporate fraud. I found the hidden money that greedy executives tried to bury. It was ironic, really. The exact skill set my family had tried to exploit to cover up their own theft became the foundation of my absolute independence. My reputation grew quickly. I went from taking small contract jobs to landing massive corporate accounts. By the end of my first year, I moved my office into a sleek high-rise overlooking the Chicago River. That was where I met Elijah. Elijah was a 36-year-old corporate attorney working for one of the most ruthless law firms in the city. We ended up on opposite sides of a massive embezzlement case. He was defending the corporation, and I was the independent auditor hired by the board of directors to find the missing funds. He was sharp, fiercely intelligent, and completely unbothered by my uncompromising nature. In fact, he thrived on it. When I presented my findings and completely dismantled his client's defense, Elijah did not get angry. He waited for me in the lobby after the meeting, bought me a cup of black coffee, and asked me out to dinner. Our relationship moved with an intense, purposeful speed. We understood each other perfectly. We were both black professionals who had clawed our way to the top of our fields. He respected my boundaries, and I admired his protective nature. Elijah was the kind of man who stood beside me, not in front of me. He celebrated my victories as if they were his own. Exactly 18 months after that first cup of coffee, he proposed. There was no grand public spectacle. It was a quiet Sunday morning in our shared penthouse. He handed me a cup of coffee and a velvet box, telling me that he wanted to spend the rest of his life building an empire with me. I said yes without a single hesitation. Planning the wedding was a seamless process until we hit the inevitable roadblock: the guest list. We were sitting at our kitchen island reviewing the final head count for our caterer. Elijah had his family coming from Detroit. He had listed his parents, his two brothers, and a handful of aunts and uncles. My side of the spreadsheet was completely blank, except for a few close colleagues and college friends. Elijah set his pen down and looked at me carefully. He knew the broad strokes of my past. He knew I had left Atlanta on bad terms and that I had cut off all contact with my family. But we had never discussed the exact details of the fallout. He respected my silence, but as our wedding day approached, his protective instincts kicked in. "Zoe," he said softly, reaching across the marble counter to take my hand. "We need to talk about your family. I know things ended terribly, but a wedding is a major life event. Are you absolutely certain you do not want to invite your parents? Even just your mother? People change in 2 years. I just do not want you to look out at the audience and regret that your family is not there to see how beautiful you are." I did not get angry. I did not break down in tears or launch into a sad monologue about how my mother had always loved my sister Brianna more than me. I had shed all my tears for Vivian and Thomas a long time ago. Instead, I gently squeezed Elijah's hand, stood up from the kitchen island, and walked into my home office. I opened my fireproof filing cabinet and unlocked the top drawer. I pulled out a thick manila folder labeled with my parents' last name. I walked back into the kitchen and slid the folder across the marble island toward my fiancé. "Read the top document," I told him, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. Elijah opened the folder. His eyes scanned the crisp legal paper, and his brow furrowed in confusion. It was not a heartfelt letter or a diary entry. It was a formally drafted cease and desist order generated by a top-tier credit defense attorney in Atlanta. "What is this?" Elijah asked, looking up at me, his lawyer brain immediately recognizing the severe legal terminology. "That is my mother," I replied calmly, taking a sip of my water. About a year after I moved to Chicago, my credit monitoring service alerted me to a hard inquiry. Someone was trying to finance a $90,000 luxury car in my name at a dealership in Buckhead. I froze my credit immediately and hired a private investigator to pull the dealership security footage. Elijah stared at me, the realization dawning on his face. The protective warmth in his eyes hardened into cold legal fury. "She tried to steal your identity. She tried to use my pristine credit score to buy a Mercedes for my sister," I corrected him. Brianna and Connor had ruined their own credit after the restaurant scandal. My mother knew my social security number by heart, She walked into that dealership pretending she had my authorization to co-sign the loan. She figured since I was out of state, I would not notice the credit hit until the car was already in their driveway. And she knew I would never actually call the police on my own mother to report the fraud. I tapped the cease and desist letter with my index finger. So I hired a lawyer to do it for me. I continued. I had him serve her with those papers right in the middle of her weekly church committee meeting. The letter explicitly stated that if she or any member of my family ever attempted to use my financial information again, I would press federal identity theft charges. I have not heard a single peep from them since. Elijah looked from the legal document back to me. The question about inviting them to the wedding was completely erased from his mind. He closed the folder, pushed it aside, and pulled me into his arms. "I am so sorry, Zoe," he whispered, kissing the top of my head. "I will never ask you about them again. They will not get anywhere near our wedding. I will hire private security to make sure of it." I leaned into his chest, feeling completely secure. I had made the right choice. I had built a life that was impenetrable. My business was booming, my credit was locked down, and I was marrying a man who would go to war for me. I truly believed I had severed the rotting branches of my family tree once and for all. I thought the cease and desist letter had been the final nail in the coffin. But I had underestimated the sheer desperation of a toxic family running out of options. The silence was not a surrender. It was just a pause. Because 2 weeks later, that silence would be broken in the most aggressive way possible, setting off a chain of events that would force me to return to the very place I had sworn never to see again. The vibration of my phone against the marble nightstand woke me up before my alarm even had the chance to ring. It was a random Tuesday morning. The sky outside our penthouse windows was still a dark slate gray, and the city of Chicago was just beginning to stir. I reached out blindly, swiping my hand across the cool surface until my fingers brushed against the buzzing device. I pulled it toward my face, squinting against the bright screen. The notification stacked on my lock screen made my blood run cold for a fraction of a second. 22 missed calls. I sat up in bed, pulling the down comforter around my shoulders. Elijah was still breathing steadily beside me, completely unaware of the digital storm happening in my hands. I unlocked my phone and scrolled through the call log. My heart rate steadied, and the initial shock quickly dissolved into a cold, calculating realization. 7 calls from my mother, Vivian. 10 calls from my father, Reverend Thomas. 5 calls from a number I did not have saved but recognized immediately as my brother-in-law, Connor. I did not panic. I did not immediately dial them back to ask who had died or who was in the hospital. I knew my family dynamics better than I knew my own reflection. A toxic family does not call the discarded scapegoat 22 times before sunrise just to say hello. They do not blow up your phone to apologize for past mistakes. They only call the black sheep when the golden child has run out of money. I slid out of bed quietly, leaving Elijah to sleep. I walked into the kitchen, the hardwood floors cool against my bare feet, and started the coffee maker. While the rich smell of espresso filled the room, I leaned against the counter and tapped the voicemail icon on my phone. There were 8 messages. I pressed play on the first one, putting the phone on speaker. "Zoe, sweetheart, it is your mother." Vivian's voice floated through the quiet kitchen, dripping with a honeyed sweetness that I had not heard in years. It sounded practiced and utterly fake. "I know it has been a long time since we spoke, and I know we have had our misunderstandings. But family is family. Give me a call back when you wake up. I just want to hear your voice." I rolled my eyes and deleted it. The second voicemail was from my father. "Zoe Elise, call your father immediately." Thomas spoke with his signature heavy pulpit voice, but there was a subtle tremor underneath his usual commanding tone. "We have a family matter that requires your attention. It is imperative that we speak today. Do not ignore this message." I deleted that one too. By the 5th voicemail, the facade of politeness had completely evaporated. The mask was slipping. "Zoe, pick up the phone right now. My mother's voice was shrill and frantic, completely stripped of the Southern Belle charm she usually weaponized. We are in serious trouble. Connor has made a mess of things and the bank is sending letters. Your father is beside himself. We need your help, Zoe. You are an accountant. You know how to talk to these people. Call me back immediately. The final voicemail was the most telling. It was Connor. He sounded out of breath as if he was pacing back and forth in a panic. Zoe, look, I know we left things in a bad place. He stammered, his arrogance entirely missing. I know you hate me. But I really need a favor. Just a consultation. A professional consultation. I will pay your hourly rate. I just need you to look at some tax documents before the end of the week. Please, Zoe. Brianna does not know how bad it is. If you do not help me, they are going to take everything. I tapped the screen and stopped the playback. The coffee machine beeped, signaling it was done. I poured myself a mug of black coffee and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the Chicago skyline. The city lights were reflecting off the dark waters of the river below. They wanted me to save them. After telling me to disappear after trying to steal my identity, after blaming me for their own financial ruin, they actually believed they could just snap their fingers and summon me back to clean up their mess. Connor had clearly dug himself a hole so deep that he could no longer lie his way out of it. And my parents, rather than holding the white son-in-law accountable, were once again trying to force me to be his shield. Elijah walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, tying the belt of his robe. He took one look at my face and stopped in his tracks. His eyes flicked to the phone resting on the marble counter. Who died? He asked, his voice thick with sleep, but laced with immediate concern. No one, I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. But someone is about to lose all their money. My parents and Connor called me 22 times this morning. They left voicemails begging for my accounting expertise. Elijah's jaw tightened. The protective instinct radiated from him instantly. He walked over and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. What are you going to do? He asked quietly. Do you want me to have the firm draft another cease and desist? I can threaten them with harassment. No, I said, setting my mug down. A cease and desist will not work this time. They are desperate. Desperate people do not care about legal warnings. They care about survival. If Connor is begging me to look at his tax documents, it means he has committed a financial crime so massive that he cannot hide it from his wealthy parents or my father congregation anymore. I picked up my phone. I had no intention of calling them back. Engaging with them directly would only give them the opportunity to manipulate the narrative, to cry, and to play the victims. I needed facts. I needed raw, unedited data before I decided my next move. I am going to take a shower, and then I am heading straight to my office. I told Elijah, turning to face him. I am not going to return their calls. Instead, I am going to find out exactly what they are hiding. I walked down the hallway toward our master bathroom, leaving my phone on the kitchen counter. Let them panic. Let them sweat. For the first time in my life, I held all the power. I was not the terrified daughter desperate for their love anymore. I was a licensed forensic accountant with access to federal financial databases. If my family wanted me to look at their money, I was going to look at everything. And I was going to find every single skeleton they had buried. The hot water of the shower did little to wash away the disgust I felt, but it sharpened my focus. I dressed quickly in a tailored suit, grabbed my keys, and made the drive down the Kennedy Expressway toward the financial district. The morning traffic was heavy, but my mind was already racing miles ahead of the brake lights. When I arrived at my office, the floor was still mostly empty. I swiped my keycard at the glass doors, walked straight into my corner suite, and locked the door behind me. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. The glow from my dual monitors was more than enough. As a forensic accountant, I had access to enterprise-level investigative software and federal financial databases that the average citizen did not even know existed. I sat down in my leather chair, cracked my knuckles, and began typing. I started with the most obvious target. I entered Connor's full legal name and his social security number, which I still had memorized from the years I spent filing his personal tax returns. The search results populated instantly, and the screen lit up with a sea of red flags. The financial ruin was staggering. Connor had not just failed at a single crypto startup. He had created a tangled web of 6 different shell companies, moving money between them in a desperate attempt to hide his mounting debts. But the shell companies were already collapsing. There were civil judgments against him from furious investors and notifications of frozen assets. But that was just the appetizer. I needed to know what he had done to my family. I opened a new tab and pulled up the property records for Fulton County, Georgia. I typed in the name of the church where my father had served as the senior pastor for over 2 decades. The church was the epicenter of our social standing in the Black community. It was the source of my father pride and my mother endless boasting. The database loaded the deed and my stomach dropped. A formal notice of default had been filed 3 months ago. The church was actively in the pre-foreclosure stage. Connor had somehow convinced my father to let him use the church property as collateral for a massive commercial loan. A loan he had completely defaulted on. The sanctuary, the pews, the community center, it was all about to be seized by a corporate bank. The betrayal was sickening. My father had jeopardized the spiritual home of hundreds of families just to bankroll his white son-in-law delusions of grandeur. But the worst discovery was yet to come. I typed in the address of the ancestral family home. We called it Big Mama House. My grandmother had spent her entire life working tirelessly, cleaning houses for wealthy families, just so she could buy that property free and clear. She had handed the deed to my parents with explicit instructions to keep it in the family forever. It was our only piece of true generational wealth. The property was supposed to be untouchable. When the current property records appeared on my screen, I felt a physical ache in my chest. There were 3 separate secondary mortgages taken out against Big Mama House over the last 2 years. The equity had been completely sucked dry. Connor had treated my grandmother's legacy like a personal ATM machine, draining every last cent of value to fund his lavish lifestyle with Brianna. And worst of all, there were 2 massive tax liens placed directly on the property by the Internal Revenue Service. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place, forming a picture of absolute devastation. The IRS was not just auditing Connor. They were investigating him for federal tax evasion and wire fraud. The federal government was circling him like sharks in bloody water. Connor was not just looking at bankruptcy. He was staring down the barrel of a decade in a federal penitentiary. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing screens. The sheer audacity of their 22 missed calls suddenly made perfect sense. They did not miss me. They did not want to reconcile. They were backed into a corner with the federal government holding the leash, and they needed a human shield. Connor was going down, and he knew it. But if he could present the IRS with a formally audited financial statement signed by a certified public accountant, claiming that the missing millions were simply the result of terrible bookkeeping rather than malicious embezzlement, he might be able to negotiate a plea deal and avoid prison time. They did not need a sister or a daughter. They needed a licensed fall guy. They wanted me to sign my name to fraudulent backdated documents. They expected me to walk into the line of federal fire, sacrifice my hard-earned CPA license, and take the legal heat so the golden child husband could walk away untouched. A cold, dark anger settled into my bones. For 35 years, they had demanded my sacrifice. They had taken my time, my money, and my peace of mind. Now they wanted my freedom. I picked up my phone and called Elijah. He answered on the first ring. I told him everything I had just found. I explained the shell companies, the foreclosure on the church, and the liens against Big Mama House. Elijah listened quietly, his legal mind analyzing the severity of the crimes. When I finished, he asked me a single question. "What do you want to do?" "I am packing a bag." I told him, my voice devoid of any emotion. "I am driving down to Georgia." Elijah let out a heavy breath. "Zoe, you cannot save them. They are in federal territory now. It is too late." "I am not going down there to save them," I replied, pulling my blazer off the back of my chair. I do not care if Connor rots in a federal cell, and I do not care if my parents lose their social standing, but I am not letting a predatory bank take Big Mama House. That property belongs to her memory, not their greed. I am going to walk into that house, and I am going to watch them squirm. I shut down my computer, locked my office, and headed back to the penthouse to pack my SUV. The 2 years of absolute silence were officially over. I was returning to the sanctuary of my childhood, but this time I was not bringing forgiveness. I was bringing a reckoning. The drive from Chicago to Atlanta took 14 hours, but I did not stop for anything other than gasoline and black coffee. The steady hum of my tires against the asphalt matched the relentless processing of my own mind. For 2 years, I had completely severed myself from the toxic environment of my youth. I had built a life of absolute peace, a thriving corporate firm, and a loving partnership with a man who respected my boundaries. I had shed the identity of the family scapegoat and stepped into my power as a successful forensic accountant. Yet as I crossed the Georgia state line and watched the familiar pine trees rise up against the darkening sky, I felt the heavy gravitational pull of my past trying to drag me back down. I was not returning to save my parents. I was returning to protect the only piece of my history that actually mattered. I navigated the winding streets of my old neighborhood until I reached the quiet cul-de-sac where my grandmother house stood. We had always called it Big Mama House. It was a sprawling 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and thick white pillars. My grandmother had spent her entire life cleaning houses for wealthy white families, saving every spare penny so she could buy this property free and clear. It was our only true piece of generational wealth. From the outside, it looked exactly as I remembered. The lawn was perfectly manicured and the porch lights glowed warmly in the evening dusk. It was a flawless facade hiding a foundation that was rotting from the inside out. I pulled my vehicle into the driveway, parking directly behind a matte black luxury sports car that undoubtedly belonged to my brother-in-law. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin for a moment, adjusting my tailored blazer and taking a deep, steadying breath. I stepped out into the humid southern air, walked up the front steps, and did not bother knocking. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped into the foyer. The air inside the house was thick with the suffocating smell of expensive floral candles and raw, unfiltered anxiety. I walked out of the hallway and stepped into the main living room. The space looked like a financial war zone. The antique mahogany coffee table, a piece of furniture my grandmother had polished by hand every Sunday, was completely buried under mountains of paperwork. Manila folders stacked high bank statements, spilling onto the Persian rug, and thick legal envelopes bearing the terrifying red stamps of final notices. My father, Reverend Thomas, sat slumped in his favorite leather armchair. The man who commanded the respect of hundreds of parishioners every Sunday morning looked broken and disheveled. He wore a wrinkled dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his usual booming confidence replaced by a hollow, exhausted stare. He was staring at the wall, completely detached from the reality of the disaster unfolding in his own living room. On the velvet sofa, my sister Brianna was curled up with a plush throw blanket, scrolling mindlessly on her phone. She was still wearing full makeup and designer loungewear, acting as if ignoring the mountain of debt would magically make it disappear. My mother Vivian was the first one to notice my arrival. She was standing by the stone fireplace, holding a stack of unopened mail tightly against her chest. When she saw me standing in the archway, she did not drop the envelopes. She did not rush over to hug the daughter she had not seen or spoken to in 2 years. She did not even ask if I had a safe drive down from Chicago. Her eyes simply darted from my face to the expensive leather handbag on my shoulder and then down to my custom-tailored suit. She took a step forward, her face immediately hardening into that familiar demanding expression I knew all too well. "Well, it certainly took you long enough," Vivian snapped, her voice cutting sharply through the tense silence of the room. She did not say hello. She did not say she missed me. She spoke to me as if I were a teenage intern who had shown up an hour late for an unpaid summer job. She was completely ignoring the fact that I was a 35-year-old chief executive officer who billed out at $500 an hour. In her mind, I was still just Zoe the scapegoat, the invisible workhorse whose only purpose was to clean up the messes the rest of them made. "Put your bag down in the hallway and come look at this mess," Vivian commanded, pointing a manicured finger toward the ruined coffee table. "Connor has been trying to organize these tax records for 3 days, but the bank keeps sending these overly complicated ledgers. We need you to sort through them right now and figure out which charges we can dispute. The accountants at the bank are making mistakes, and we need you to fix it before the church board finds out." I stood in the entryway, completely unfazed by her aggressive greeting. The sheer entitlement radiating from her was almost breathtaking. She was standing in my grandmother's house, a house that had been secretly mortgaged to the brink of federal foreclosure, and she was casually ordering me to fix it as if I were being asked to sweep the kitchen floor. I slowly took off my sunglasses and folded them, placing them securely into my handbag. I did not move toward the coffee table. I did not drop my bag. I simply looked at her, letting the silence stretch out until it became deeply uncomfortable. "Are you deaf?" Vivian hissed, taking another step toward me. "We are dealing with a massive crisis here, Zoe. Your father is under an immense amount of stress, and Brianna has been crying all morning because her credit cards were declined. We do not have time for your usual stubborn attitude. You are an accountant. You know how to talk to these people. Sit down and get to work." I looked at my mother, marveling at the depth of her delusion. She had built an entire alternate reality where Connor was simply a victim of complicated banking errors, where Brianna was suffering the most, and where I existed solely to absorb their consequences. My father remained silent in his chair, refusing to look me in the eye. The great spiritual leader of the community was hiding behind his spoiled daughter and his manipulative wife. "I am not here to sort your mail," I said, my voice dangerously low and perfectly steady. "I am not your secretary, and I am certainly not your unpaid intern." Vivian's face flushed with instant rage. "How dare you speak to me that way under this roof?" she spat. "We are your family. We need your help, and you walk in here acting like you are better than us. You owe us your expertise after abandoning your sister for 2 years." I did not raise my voice. I held her furious gaze and let a cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. I owed them absolutely nothing. And as I watched Connor walk into the room carrying another stack of fraudulent papers, I knew it was time to show them exactly how little power they had left. Connor walked into the living room carrying a thick manila envelope. He was wearing a designer polo shirt that clung to his shoulders, but his usual perfectly coiffed hair was a mess. When he saw me standing in the center of the room, his expression shifted. The panic in his eyes was quickly buried under a thick layer of that signature arrogant entitlement he used to navigate the world. He tossed the envelope onto the coffee table, sending a few loose papers fluttering to the floor. "Glad to see you finally decided to join the real world, Zoe," he said, running a hand through his hair. "We have a minor situation here, and your mother thought it would be best if we brought you in to handle the administrative side of things." I looked down at the manila envelope, and then back up at him. Administrative side of things. That was an interesting way to describe federal tax evasion. Connor stepped around the coffee table and picked up a stapled packet of documents. He held it out to me, but I kept my hands firmly at my sides. He let out a sharp, exasperated sigh and dropped the packet onto the edge of the table nearest to me. "Look, I know you have your little bookkeeping business up in Chicago." Connor began, his voice taking on a slow, patronizing cadence. "But corporate finance is an entirely different beast. What we have here is a simple cash flow bottleneck. I moved some capital from the church reserve fund and your parents' home equity to leverage a bridge loan for my tech startup. It is a standard venture capital strategy. The problem is, the bank flagged the transfers because of a small clerical error in the reporting codes. A small clerical error," I repeated, keeping my voice completely flat. "Exactly," Connor said, snapping his fingers and pointing at me as if I were a slow student who had finally grasped a basic concept. "It is just a misunderstanding regarding overhead misappropriation. The IRS is making a mountain out of a molehill. All I need you to do is review these retroactive audit forms. I have already filled out the numbers. You just need to sign your name on the bottom line with your CPA license number and stamp it. It shows the federal tax board that an independent accountant has verified the internal transfer of funds and clears up the bottleneck. I stared at him, marveling at his absolute audacity. He was standing in front of a licensed forensic accountant, a woman who spent her days dismantling complex corporate fraud schemes for Fortune 500 companies, and he was trying to explain basic tax law to me like I was a child. Worse, he was trying to gaslight me into believing that embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from a church and secretly mortgaging a fully paid-off home was just a clerical error. "Let me get this straight," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You want me to sign a backdated audit form. You want me to attach my state board license number to a document that falsely categorizes stolen funds as a legitimate internal capital transfer." Connor rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed that I was not just blindly following his instructions. "It is not stolen funds, Zoe. Do not be dramatic. It is leveraged debt. You just do not understand how high-level tech investments work. Once my startup goes public, I will pay the church back with interest. But right now, I need you to be a team player. Your parents need you to be a team player. If you do not sign those papers, the bank is going to start foreclosure proceedings against this house." My father spoke up from his leather armchair, his voice heavy with misplaced authority. "Just sign the papers, Zoe. Connor knows what he is doing. We need to present a united front to the bank. You are the only one in the family with the proper licensing to make this problem go away." I turned my gaze to my father. "You are asking me to commit federal bank fraud?" I said, clearly pronouncing every single word, so there could be no misunderstanding. "You are asking me to perjure myself to the Internal Revenue Service. If I sign those papers and the IRS audits the source accounts, I will lose my CPA license. I will face massive federal fines. I could go to federal prison." Brianna scoffed from the couch, tossing her throw blanket aside. "Oh, stop being so melodramatic, Zoe. Always playing the victim. Connor said it is just a formality. Why do you always have to make everything about you? Just sign the stupid paper so we can all go back to our lives." The sheer stupidity in the room was almost suffocating. They genuinely believed that a signature would magically erase millions of dollars of missing money. They believed the federal government would just look the other way because Connor said so. "I will not sign anything," I said, turning my attention back to Connor. "I will not put my name on your fraudulent documents. I will not risk my career and my freedom to save you from the consequences of your own theft. You made this mess. You can face the federal prosecutors yourself." The smug arrogance vanished from Connor's face instantly. The veins in his neck bulged, and his face flushed a deep, angry red. He took 2 large steps, closing the distance between us until he was standing less than a foot away from me. He was taller than me and broader, and he used his physical size to loom over me in a textbook display of male intimidation. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little bitch!" Connor hissed, his voice dropping into a menacing growl. "You are going to sign those papers. I let you walk away 2 years ago, but I am not playing games with you today. This is about my future. This is about my reputation. You owe this family, and you are going to do exactly what I tell you to do." He raised his hand slightly, as if he was going to grab my arm or shove me backward. A lesser woman would have taken a step back. A lesser woman would have lowered her eyes or flinched under the threat of physical violence. I did not flinch. I did not move a single inch. I tilted my head up, maintaining direct, unbreakable eye contact with him. My heart rate did not even spike. After dealing with aggressive millionaire executives in Chicago boardrooms, a desperate broke man in a polo shirt was absolutely nothing to me. "If you touch me," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that was colder than ice, "I will have you arrested for assault before you even have the chance to be indicted for tax evasion. Step back, Connor. Now!" He hesitated, his chest heaving as he stared into my eyes. He was looking for fear. He was looking for the timid, obedient sister-in-law he remembered from 2 years ago. But that woman was dead. All he found was a titanium wall. Slowly, reluctantly, Connor took a step back, his hands clenching into tight fists at his sides. I had won the physical standoff, but the war in that living room was far from over. I watched as Connor retreated to the other side of the coffee table. The air in the room was thick with tension, but I was completely in my element. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my iPad. My father had always loved showing off his expensive electronics, which meant the massive smart television mounted above the stone fireplace was equipped with the latest wireless casting technology. I tapped the screen of my tablet swiped down and mirrored my display directly to the television. The screen flickered for a second before replacing the generic landscape screensaver with a stark white spreadsheet. The font was large, crisp, and completely undeniable. "What are you doing?" my father asked, his voice trembling slightly as he sat forward in his leather armchair. He squinted at the glowing numbers on the screen. "I am doing the administrative work you requested," I said smoothly, walking over to stand next to the television like I was giving a corporate presentation. "But instead of signing fraudulent documents, I am going to show you exactly where the money went." I tapped the screen, expanding the first row of data. "Let us start with the Church Reserve Fund," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "Connor claimed he moved capital for a bridge loan. That is a lie. On October 14th of last year, Connor authorized a wire transfer of $85,000 directly from the congregation tithing account. But it did not go to a tech startup. It went to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under his middle name. I swiped to the next slide. A scanned copy of the wire authorization appeared complete with Connor digital signature. 2 months later, I continued ignoring Connor, panicked, breathing behind me. He transferred another $120,000. This time, it was drained straight from the church building maintenance fund. You know, the money the congregation raised to fix the leaking roof in the sanctuary. That money was routed through 3 different holding accounts before landing in a private offshore trust. Brianna sat up on the couch, her jaw dropping. "Connor, what is she talking about?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "You told me the church loan was just a formality." "Shut up, Brianna." Connor snapped, his face pale and slick with sweat. "She is manipulating the data. She is trying to frame me because she hates us." I did not even look at him. I just kept swiping. "And then we have Big Mama House," I said, pointing to the third document on the screen. "It was a secondary mortgage agreement. My grandmother left this house to you completely paid off. But Connor convinced you to sign over the equity. He took out 3 separate loans against this property, totaling $300,000. He blew it all to keep his shell companies afloat. He has not made a single payment in 6 months. That is why the bank is threatening foreclosure. There is no clerical error. There is no misunderstanding. Your golden son-in-law stole over $500,000 from you and from the church." The living room descended into a stunned, suffocating silence. The glowing spreadsheet illuminated the horror on my father's face. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open, unable to process the magnitude of the betrayal. He had trusted Connor implicitly, because Connor was white wealthy and supposedly possessed the financial acumen my father desperately wanted to be associated with. Now the raw, undeniable proof of his theft was displayed in high definition. I waited for the explosion. I waited for my father to rise from his chair and throw Connor out of the house. I waited for my mother to scream at the man who had destroyed her mother's legacy. But the explosion never came. Instead, my mother Vivian took a deep breath, smoothed the front of her expensive skirt, and turned toward me with a look of profound annoyance. "Well," Vivian sighed, waving her hand dismissively at the television. "He made a bad investment, Zoe. There is no need to stand there and crucify him." I froze. The cold calculation in my mind short-circuited for a fraction of a second. I stared at her, genuinely wondering if I had heard her correctly. "A bad investment," I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "Mom, he embezzled church funds, he forged documents, he took out secret mortgages on Big Mama House. It is federal wire fraud. Keep your voice down, Vivian hissed, glancing nervously toward the front windows as if the neighbors could hear us. Connor is an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs take risks. Sometimes those risks do not pan out. You are acting like he did this maliciously. He was trying to build wealth for his family, for your sister. I looked at my father expecting him to intervene. He was the pastor. He was the man responsible for the church money. But Thomas just buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, weary sigh. He was actually going along with her twisted logic. He was too terrified of the scandal to hold Connor accountable. He was under a lot of pressure, my father mumbled from behind his hands. The tech market is volatile. We just need to figure out how to cover the deficit before the deacons audit the church accounts next month. The sheer level of delusion was staggering. They were looking at ironclad proof of felony theft, and they were still making excuses for him. They were still protecting him. Do you hear yourselves? I asked, the cold anger returning to my voice sharper than before. He stole from you. He stole from the people who sit in your pews every Sunday. And you are defending him. You are actually defending the man who is about to make you homeless. He is your brother-in-law. Vivian snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. He is family, and family protects each other. That is something you would understand if you were not so bitter and alone. If you would just sign those audit papers, we could restructure the debt and give Connor time to recover the funds. My blood boiled. They were so deeply entrenched in their toxic enabling that they would gladly burn my life to the ground to keep Connor warm. They did not care about the truth. They did not care about justice or my grandmother legacy. They only cared about keeping up appearances. The fury inside me solidified into something dark and absolute. I knew in that moment that I could not just walk away and let the bank take the house. I had to completely dismantle their fake reality. Before I could say another word, Brianna stood up from the couch. Her hands were shaking, and her face was a mask of pure desperation. She looked at me, her eyes wide and panicked, and then she dropped the bomb that would change everything. You do not have a choice, Zoe. Brianna screamed the words so loudly that her voice cracked under the weight of her own panic. She stood up from the plush sofa, her hands shaking violently. Her manicured nails dug into the palms of her hands, and tears were finally spilling over her eyelashes, ruining her perfect makeup. You have to sign the retroactive audit. You have to do it right now. I looked at her, my expression completely unchanged. I slowly lowered my iPad, letting the screen dim as the undeniable proof of Connor embezzlement remained projected on the living room television. I do not have to do anything, Brianna, I replied, my voice low and steady. I am not legally bound to your husband and his financial crimes. I am walking out of this house and leaving you all to the federal authorities. Yes, you are legally bound, Brianna shrieked, taking a step toward me. You are already in it. Your name is on the original loan documents. I put it there. The words hung in the humid air of the living room, heavy and suffocating. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the low hum of the central air conditioning seemed to fade into the background. I stood perfectly still, processing the magnitude of what she had just confessed. What did you just say? I asked, forcing her to repeat her crime out loud in front of everyone. Brianna crossed her arms defensively, though she was trembling from head to toe. Connor needed a certified public accountant to act as a financial guarantor for the bridge loan. She explained, her voice wavering between defiance and terror. The bank would not approve the commercial transfer against the church property without a licensed professional signing off on the risk assessment. You were the only CPA we knew, and you had just walked out on us at the restaurant 2 years ago. You abandoned us when we needed you the most. So you forged my signature, I stated. It was not a question. It was a cold, hard fact. I had to, Brianna cried out, looking at our parents for validation. Connor investors were threatening to pull out. The bank sent the paperwork and they needed it back the next morning. I found some of your old tax filings in the home office upstairs. I took them into my bedroom and I practiced your signature for 3 hours until it was absolutely perfect. I signed your name and I used your state board license number. The bank accepted it. I did what I had to do to protect my marriage. I turned to look at my father. I expected the Reverend to finally show some righteous anger. Forgery was a federal felony. Identity theft was a felony. His youngest daughter, the golden child he had protected and coddled for her entire life, had just confessed to committing multiple federal crimes against his eldest daughter. But Reverend Thomas just stared at the Persian rug, avoiding my gaze entirely. He looked like a deflated balloon, completely stripped of his moral authority. Vivian, however, saw an opportunity. The initial shock on my mother's face quickly morphed into a twisted mask of relief. Her mind worked in mysterious and toxic ways, immediately searching for a path that would absolve her favorite child and place the burden squarely back onto my shoulders. "Well, there you have it," Vivian said, her tone suddenly brisk and practical, as if Brianna had just admitted to borrowing a sweater without asking. "What is done, is done. Brianna made a mistake, but she did it to save her husband. And now that your name is already on the original loan, you are legally implicated anyway." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, completely disgusted by her lack of basic human decency. "You are justifying felony identity theft," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I am being realistic," Vivian snapped back, crossing her arms. "If the bank forecloses and the federal investigators look into the paperwork, they are going to see your signature, Zoe. They will come after your CPA license. They will come after your fancy accounting firm in Chicago. You will lose everything you have built. So you need to fix this." Connor straightened his shirt, the fear completely vanishing from his posture. He actually smiled. It was a predatory, sickening smile. He stepped away from the television and walked back to the coffee table, tapping his fingers confidently against the stack of fraudulent audit papers. "Your mother is right, Zoe," Connor said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "We are all in the same boat now. If I go down for bank fraud, you are coming down with me. The federal prosecutors will not care that Brianna forged your name. They will see your professional license attached to a defaulted commercial loan. Your career will be over. You will be facing federal prison time right next to me." He picked up a silver pen from the table and held it out toward me. "So you can either sign this retroactive audit and make the problem disappear for all of us," Connor continued, "or you can walk out that door and watch your precious independent life burn to the ground. Be a smart girl, Zoe. Sign the paper." The room went dead silent again. They were all watching me. They were waiting for the inevitable breakdown. For 35 years they had conditioned me to absorb their pain and panic. They expected my knees to buckle. They expected me to start hyperventilating, to cry, to beg for a way out. In their minds, I was backed into a corner with absolutely no escape route. The golden child had played her ultimate trump card, and I was supposed to fold. They expected the terrified scapegoat to grab the pen out of sheer self-preservation and do exactly what she was told. I stood perfectly still. Inside my mind, a million calculations were running simultaneously. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how federal banking laws worked. I knew the burden of proof required for wire fraud, identity theft, and falsifying corporate documents. I knew that bank documents required notarization, IP address tracking for digital submissions, and physical witness signatures. I knew that I could pull my own credit reports, location data, and flight records to prove I was in Chicago the day that loan was executed. Brianna thought she had trapped me in a burning building. What she did not realize was that she had just handed me the match to burn her entire life to the ground. I looked at Brianna, flushed, tear-stained face. I looked at Vivian, triumphant smirk. I looked at Connor, arrogant stance, and the silver pen he was holding out to me. They had completely underestimated the woman standing in front of them. They thought the threat of losing my career would make me compliant. But I had built my empire with my own two hands, and I knew exactly how to defend it against amateurs. I did not break down in terror. I did not reach for the pen. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I smiled. It was a slow, cold, genuine smile that reached my eyes. It was the kind of smile that made the triumphant look on Connor's face falter immediately. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as they realized their ultimate weapon had just completely misfired. My smile completely unnerved them. The smug satisfaction on Connor's face melted away, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. Vivian uncrossed her arms and took a hesitant step back. They had expected me to fold under the pressure of the forged document. They had expected me to panic and beg for a way out. But they were about to learn what happens when you corner a forensic accountant who has absolutely nothing left to lose. "You really think a forged signature is a trap?" I asked, walking slowly back to the center of the room. "You think the federal government just looks at a piece of paper and calls it a day? Let me educate you on how modern banking investigations actually work." I pointed directly at Brianna, who shrank back against the plush fabric of the sofa. When a commercial bank executes a loan of that magnitude, they do not just file the paperwork in a cabinet. They log the IP address of the device used to submit the digital forms. They track the geographical location data of the electronic signature. I have my flight records, my credit card receipts, and the badge swipe logs from my office building in Chicago, proving I was 800 miles away on the exact day and time that document was signed. I can prove in 5 minutes that I did not sign that loan. But more importantly, the digital forensics team will trace the submission right back to the router in this very house. They will execute a search warrant. They will find the practice sheets in your bedroom, Brianna. They will pull the metadata from your laptop. They will charge you with felony identity theft and federal wire fraud. Brianna let out a strangled sob, covering her face with her trembling hands. The reality of federal prison suddenly crashing down on her perfect life. My mother gasped, her face draining of all color. "Zoe, you would not!" Vivian pleaded, her voice suddenly desperate and high-pitched. "She is your sister. She is family. She would go to federal prison. She would lose everything. She put my name on a fraudulent loan to save her cheating husband." I shot back, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "She was perfectly fine with me going to prison. Do not ever talk to me about sisterly loyalty again." I turned my attention to Connor, who was staring at me like I was a ghost. His arrogant posture had completely collapsed. "You wanted me to fix this," I said, my voice dropping into a tone of absolute command. "You wanted me to use my professional license to make the missing money look like an internal accounting error. If I am going to risk my entire career to save Brianna from a federal prison sentence, I am not doing it blind. I am not signing a backdated audit based on numbers you scribbled on a piece of paper. The IRS does not play games. If they find a single discrepancy in my audit, they will tear all of us apart. So if you want my signature, I need everything." "What do you mean, everything?" Connor asked, his voice tight and defensive. "I mean full, unrestricted administrative access," I said, taking a step closer to him until he was forced to lean back. "I want the master passwords to the church financial servers. I want the login credentials for every single bank account, every shell company, and every offshore trust you created. I want your laptop, and I want the encryption keys to your hard drives. I need to see every single dollar you moved so I can build a narrative that will actually fool a federal auditor. If I find a single hidden account that you did not disclose, the IRS will find it too, and our entire cover story falls apart." Connor shook his head vigorously, his eyes darting around the room. "No, absolutely not," he stammered. "That is highly classified proprietary information. You do not need access to my personal hard drives to audit the church reserve fund. I already gave you the numbers on that spreadsheet. Just use those." I let out a harsh laugh that echoed in the quiet room. "Proprietary information. You are a thief, Connor, not a tech visionary. You stole money from a church. You are asking me to orchestrate a massive financial cover-up to keep your wife out of jail. I am the only person standing between you and a fluorescent orange jumpsuit. So here are your two options. You give me the passwords right now and let me do my job, or I walk out that front door, get in my car, and drive straight to the FBI field office in downtown Atlanta." I will hand them the proof of the forged signature, and I will let them tear your entire life apart by morning. Connor's jaw clenched tightly. He looked at my father, hoping for backup. He was used to the Reverend bending over backward to accommodate him. Thomas, you cannot seriously expect me to hand over my private servers to her, Connor pleaded. She hates me. She will use it against me. She is just trying to steal my startup data. For the first time all evening, my father actually stood up to Connor. Thomas looked at his sobbing daughter on the couch, and then looked at his son-in-law. The illusion of the wealthy, successful businessman was completely shattered. Thomas finally realized that Connor was nothing but a massive liability who had dragged his favorite child into a federal crime. Give her the passwords, Connor, my father commanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and absolute exhaustion. You dragged Brianna into this mess. You made her commit a felony under my roof. Give Zoe whatever she needs to fix this before we all lose everything. Connor looked at Vivian, but my mother just nodded frantically, her hands clasped together in sheer terror at the thought of her golden child going to prison. Connor was completely cornered. The slick venture capitalist had been stripped of all his power. His chest heaved in defeat as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands were trembling as he opened a secure notes application. He spent the next 15 minutes reading off complex alphanumeric passwords, server addresses, and encryption keys, while I typed them directly into my iPad. I demanded the two-factor authentication codes, forcing him to log into his email and grant me master access to the church accounting software. I made him transfer the administrator privileges to my own secure server. I did not stop until I had completely bypassed every security measure he had put in place. When it was over, Connor looked physically sick. He walked over to his leather briefcase, pulled out his heavy laptop, and tossed it onto the coffee table. He pushed it toward me like it was a live grenade. There, he muttered, refusing to make eye contact. That is everything. All the shell companies, the crypto accounts, everything I touched. Just make the audit look legitimate so the bank stops calling and the federal agents stay away. I picked up the heavy laptop and tucked it under my arm alongside my iPad. I looked around the living room at the four people who had spent my entire life treating me like I was beneath them. They were broken, terrified, and completely dependent on me. They thought handing over the passwords was the first step in their salvation. They thought I was going to spend the night building a fake audit to protect Brianna. I will need absolute silence while I work, I told them, my voice devoid of any warmth. Do not interrupt me. Do not knock on the door. Do not ask me for updates. I am going into my old bedroom and I am locking the door. I turned and walked toward the staircase, leaving them sitting in the suffocating silence of their own making. As I climbed the wooden stairs, I felt the heavy weight of the laptop under my arm. It was not a burden, it was a loaded weapon. I had just gained unrestricted access to the deepest, darkest corners of Connor financial life. I had everything I needed to turn the forgery into the final nail in their coffin. I was not going to build a cover story. I was going to dig until I found the real truth. And I knew with absolute certainty that the rot went much deeper than a failing tech startup. I walked into my old childhood bedroom and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The room had not changed in 2 years. The walls were still painted the pale yellow my mother had chosen over my objections, and my high school debate trophies were still gathering dust on the corner bookshelf. It was a room designed for a quiet, obedient daughter. I set Connor's laptop and my iPad down on the small wooden desk. I was no longer that daughter. I cracked my knuckles connected to my secure Chicago server via a virtual private network and began the digital autopsy. For the first 3 hours, I simply mapped out the damage. I traced the money Connor had siphoned from the church reserve fund, routing it through 3 different shell companies before it landed in a high-yield offshore account. I documented the exact dates and amounts he had extracted from Big Mama House, watching the equity of my grandmother's life work, bleed out into a failed cryptocurrency venture. Connor was incredibly arrogant, but he was not exceptionally smart. His digital footprints were everywhere. He used the same variations of passwords for his secure servers, and he kept unencrypted spreadsheets labeled with obvious acronyms. But around 3 in the morning, the glowing screen revealed an anomaly that made me sit up straight. I was running a batch trace on the routing numbers associated with the commercial bank loans when a secondary property tax identification number flashed across my monitor. It was not the church. It was not Big Mama House. It was a residential property code. I opened a new search window and logged directly into the Fulton County Property Registrar. I typed in the identification number and hit enter. When the deed populated on the screen, my breath caught in my throat. It was the address of the house I was currently sitting in. My parents had paid off their primary residence 10 years ago. My father had even hosted a mortgage burning party in the backyard, inviting half the congregation to celebrate his financial prudence. But according to the county records, the house was no longer free and clear. 8 months ago, a massive secondary balloon mortgage had been taken out against the property for $450,000. The loan had been originated by the same predatory commercial lender Connor used for his tech startup. I pulled the digital signature logs. My parents' names were on the authorization forms, but the Internet Protocol address matched Connor's secure office network. He had either forged their signatures just like Brianna had forged mine, or he had buried the mortgage paperwork in a stack of investment documents and tricked them into signing away their own home. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale gray light through the bedroom window. I did not feel exhausted. The adrenaline pumping through my veins was absolute. I disconnected the laptop, grabbed my iPad, and unlocked my bedroom door. I walked down the carpeted stairs, the silence of the early morning wrapping around me. When I reached the kitchen, I found my mother Vivian standing by the marble island. She was wearing a silk robe, brewing a pot of expensive French roast coffee, as if this were just a normal Wednesday morning. She looked up when I entered, attempting to plaster a tight, artificial smile on her face. "Good morning, Zoe," Vivian said, her voice overly bright and strained. "Did you finish the audit? Connor is hoping you can submit the paperwork before noon so he can call the bank and get this silly misunderstanding cleared up." I walked over to the kitchen island and placed my iPad flat on the marble surface directly in front of her. I tapped the screen, bringing up the Fulton County property deed and the commercial loan origination documents. "There is no audit, Mom," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth. But I did find out exactly how deep the rot goes. "Look at the screen." Vivian frowned, setting her coffee mug down. She leaned forward, adjusting her reading glasses. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon and the massive 6-figure debt attached to her home address. The artificial smile slid right off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. "What is this?" Vivian whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the marble counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. "This is our house. We do not have a mortgage." "You do now," I told her coldly. "Connor did not just steal from the church, and he did not just drain Big Mama House. He took out a $450,000 balloon mortgage on your primary residence. He leveraged the roof over your head to pay off his angry investors. You and Dad are completely broke. When the bank forecloses next month, they are going to take the church, my grandmother house, and the very kitchen you are standing in." I expected her to scream. I expected her to march upstairs, drag Connor out of bed, and throw him out onto the front lawn. Any rational mother, any rational homeowner, would have been consumed by a protective rage. But Vivian was not rational. Her entire existence was built on the fragile foundation of social perception. She slowly pushed the iPad away and closed her eyes, taking a deep, trembling breath. When she opened her eyes again, the terror had been replaced by a desperate, manic calculation. "You have to fix the numbers, Zoe," she said, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "You have to move the liabilities around. Hide this mortgage in the church operating expenses." I stared at her, completely stunned. "Hide it in the church expenses," I repeated. "Mom, he stole your house. He stole your money. You are the victim here and you want me to help him cover it up. You do not understand, Vivian hissed, stepping around the island and grabbing my forearm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. If this scandal breaks, the entire Black church community will lose faith in your father. He is a pillar of Atlanta society. If the deacons find out that a white man swindled Reverend Thomas under his own roof, if they find out his golden son-in-law is a common thief, your father will be a laughingstock. His legacy will be destroyed. We will be ruined socially. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and then looked directly into her eyes. You are about to be homeless, I said, spelling it out for her. You are going to lose your home, and you are worried about what the church ladies are going to say at the Sunday social. We can always buy another house. Vivian shot back, her voice rising with hysteria. But we cannot buy back our reputation. Brianna marriage will be a public disgrace. I will not allow my family to be humiliated in front of the entire congregation. You are a forensic accountant. You know how to make money disappear on paper. Do your job, Zoe. Protect your family. I yanked my arm out of her grasp, stepping back as if she had physically burned me. The hypocrisy was so thick it was choking me. They would gladly sacrifice a Black congregation, they would sacrifice my grandmother's legacy, and they would sacrifice their own home just to protect the illusion of white wealth and social superiority. They were so deeply infected by their own vanity that there was absolutely no saving them. I will not hide a single cent, I told her, my voice echoing in the large kitchen. I am not going to protect a man who stole everything from you, and I am certainly not going to protect your fake reputation. Vivian's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure spite. If you do not help us, she threatened, you are just as dead to me as you were 2 years ago. I picked up my iPad and turned my back on her. The threat meant nothing to me anymore. Let her cling to her reputation while her house burned down around her. I had found the stolen mortgages and the offshore accounts, but I was not finished. There was one more encrypted folder on Connor hard drive that I had not cracked yet, and I had a feeling that the final secret was going to be the one that completely shattered their precious illusion once and for all. I walked back up the stairs, leaving my mother alone in the kitchen with the reality of her impending homelessness. I locked the bedroom door once again and sat down at the small desk. The sun was fully up now, shining brightly through the window, but the room still felt cold. I pulled Connor's heavy laptop toward me. I had already uncovered the wire fraud, the embezzlement, and the secret mortgages, but there was one piece of the digital puzzle that still did not fit. I had noticed it around 2 in the morning. There was an encrypted folder buried deep within his system files. It was masked as a system update log, but the file size was far too massive for a simple software patch. I connected my iPad to the laptop using a specialized decryption cable. I ran a brute force algorithm that I normally reserved for corporate espionage cases. Connor thought he was clever by using a military-grade encryption protocol, but he had used the same master password structure for his administrative backdoor. It took my software exactly 14 minutes to break the encryption. The folder unzipped and populated on my screen. I leaned forward, expecting to see the hidden crypto wallets or the offshore bank routing numbers that he had refused to give me. Instead, my screen filled with photographs. I clicked on the first image. It was a high-resolution photo of Connor standing on a wide front porch with his arm wrapped around a slender blonde woman. She was smiling brightly, holding a toddler on her hip, while another young child clung to Connor's leg. They looked like the perfect American family. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was that these were old photos from a past relationship before he met my sister. But then I looked at the timestamp in the corner of the image. The photo had been taken 3 weeks ago. It was taken on the exact weekend Connor told Brianna he was flying to Silicon Valley to meet with angel investors. I opened the next file. It was a digital copy of a birth certificate from the state of South Carolina. The child was 3 years old. The father was listed as Connor, and the mother was listed as a woman named Lauren. The second birth certificate was for a 1-year-old boy. Connor had 2 secret children, He had an entire second family living 2 states over. The cold realization washed over me. I started clicking through the rest of the documents in the folder faster now, matching the dates and the amounts to the financial ledgers I had already audited. The puzzle pieces locked together with sickening precision. The $85,000 wire transfer from the church reserve fund was not seed money for a tech startup. It was the exact amount used for a 20% down payment on a 4-bedroom house in Charleston, South Carolina. I found the deed right there in the folder. The property was held in a private trust with Lauren listed as the primary beneficiary. I pulled up the church maintenance fund ledger on my iPad and cross-referenced it with the bank statements inside the hidden folder. Every single month, Connor had been funneling $4,000 out of the congregation tithes. He coded the transactions as building repairs and landscaping services. But the money was going straight into a joint checking account he shared with Lauren. The church parishioners were unknowingly paying for his mistress' groceries, her utility bills, and the private preschool tuition for his secret toddlers. But the final blow was tracing the equity from my grandmother's house. Big Mama had scrubbed floors until her knees bled to secure that property. I watched the numbers flow from the secondary balloon mortgage Connor had tricked my parents into signing directly into a luxury car dealership in South Carolina. He had used my grandmother's legacy to buy his white mistress a brand new luxury SUV outright. He had used the remaining funds to finance lavish family vacations to the Bahamas with Lauren and the kids, while Brianna sat at home in Atlanta planning country club anniversary parties. Connor was not a failed tech entrepreneur. There was no startup. There was no cryptocurrency venture. It was all a massive, elaborate lie designed to siphon generational wealth from a black family to fund a secret white family 2 states away. He had preyed on my father's desperation for social validation and my mother blind worship of his perceived status. He had bled them completely dry, and then he had the absolute audacity to demand that I use my professional license to cover his tracks and go to federal prison in his place. I leaned back in the wooden desk chair, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. The sheer magnitude of his deception was breathtaking. He had destroyed my parents' financial future. He had stolen from the church community, and he had made a complete mockery of his marriage to Brianna. My sister had stood in that living room a few hours ago screaming that I was ruining her perfect life. She had forged my signature to protect a marriage that did not even exist. She had willingly committed a federal felony to save a man who was spending her inheritance on another woman. She treated me like garbage to defend a man who viewed our entire family as nothing more than an automated teller machine. I thought about the sheer entitlement it took for Connor to pull this off. He walked into a black church, shook my father's hand, and immediately began plotting how to drain the congregation dry. He moved into my grandmother's house and secretly mortgaged the roof over my parents' heads. He sat at our dinner table eating the food my family provided while secretly messaging a white woman 2 states away, promising her a life built entirely on stolen money. The absolute arrogance of his actions fueled a fire inside me that burned away any lingering exhaustion. I carefully dragged all the photos, the birth certificates, the mortgage deeds, and the bank statements onto my secure external hard drive. I made 3 separate digital backups. I was not just building a defense anymore. I had the nuclear codes to completely obliterate Connor life. I closed the laptop and unplugged my devices. The morning sun was shining brightly now, completely illuminating the pale yellow walls of my old bedroom. I felt an intense, terrifying clarity. My parents wanted me to hide the truth to protect their social standing. They wanted to pretend that the golden child had a perfect life and that the white son-in-law was a successful businessman. They were willing to sacrifice me to maintain that illusion. I picked up my iPad and unlocked the bedroom door. The house was quiet. They were probably all trying to sleep, believing that the obedient scapegoat was upstairs working hard to save them. They had no idea that I had just uncovered the rot at the very foundation of their reality. I walked down the hallway toward my parents' master bedroom. I was not going to wait for a family meeting. I was going to force them to look at exactly what they had traded their souls for. I left my old bedroom with the iPad firmly gripped in my hand. The hallway was silent, but I could hear the faint murmur of voices coming from the kitchen below. My parents were awake. They were probably discussing how quickly I would cave, how quickly the obedient scapegoat would draft the fraudulent audit and save their precious social standing. I walked down the stairs, my footsteps completely silent against the thick carpet. When I reached the bottom, I did not go into the kitchen. I walked straight to my father's private study at the end of the hall. The study was a room I was rarely allowed to enter as a child. It was my father's sanctuary. The walls were lined with heavy theological books, and the air smelled of lemon polish and old paper. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, meant to intimidate anyone who sat on the opposite side. I stood in the doorway and called out to them. My voice was calm and even. I told them to come into the study immediately. My father Thomas appeared first, followed closely by my mother Vivian. They both looked exhausted, but there was a glimmer of hopeful anticipation in their eyes. They thought I had finished the paperwork. They thought I was going to hand them their salvation. They walked into the room and I stepped back, pulling the heavy oak door shut. I turned the brass lock until it clicked loudly in the quiet room. My mother frowned at the sound of the lock. "Why are you locking the door, Zoe?" she asked, her tone laced with her usual irritation. "Where are the audit papers? Connor is waiting upstairs." "There are no audit papers," I said, walking around the massive mahogany desk and taking my father's leather chair. I sat down and placed the iPad flat on the polished wood. "I told you I would find out exactly where the money went before I signed anything. I found it. I found all of it." My father stepped forward, resting his hands on the back of the guest chair. He looked down at the blank screen of the tablet. "Well," he sighed heavily. "How bad is the tech startup deficit? How much time do we need to buy to let the investments mature?" I reached out and tapped the screen, unlocking the device. I opened the encrypted folder I had pulled from Connor hard drive. I did not start with the bank statements or the offshore routing numbers. I started with the photograph. I expanded the high-resolution image of Connor standing on the porch of the South Carolina house, his arm wrapped tightly around his blonde mistress, with two secret children clinging to him. I turned the iPad around and slid it across the mahogany desk until it rested directly in front of my parents. "There is no tech startup," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. "There are no venture capitalists. Look at the screen. That is where the church tithes went. That is where the equity from Big Mama House went. He bought them a 4-bedroom house in Charleston. The little boy is 3 years old. The baby is 1. He has been funding an entire second family with your money." I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and waited for the explosion. I braced myself for the raw, unfiltered wrath of a father discovering that his daughter had been betrayed. I expected Thomas to roar. I expected him to sweep the iPad off the desk, to storm upstairs and drag Connor out of the bed by his throat. I expected Vivian to scream, to break down in tears of righteous fury for the golden child she had protected her entire life. I expected them to finally wake up from their delusion and protect Brianna. But the explosion never came. Instead, the study descended into a terrifying, suffocating silence. Thomas stared at the glowing screen, his hands gripping the leather back of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. He did not move. He did not blink. Vivian stood frozen beside him, her eyes locked on the smiling face of the white woman standing next to her son-in-law. The silence stretched on for 10 seconds, then 20. The only sound in the room was the heavy, ragged breathing of my father. I watched them closely, waiting for the shock to wear off and the anger to take over. But as I studied their faces, I realized with a sickening clarity that the emotion paralyzing them was not anger. It was fear. It was sheer, absolute terror. "Mom," I prompted, pushing the issue. "Did you hear what I said? He is not a businessman. He is a con artist. He is married to someone else in everything but name. He used Brianna for her proximity to your wealth. He stole your money to build a life with a white woman." Vivian slowly pulled her gaze away from the screen. She looked at me, and her face was a mask of pure panic. She reached out with a trembling hand and pushed the iPad back toward me. "You must delete this," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "You have to delete this right now. You cannot show this to anyone." I stared at her, genuinely believing I had misheard her. "Delete it," I repeated. "Mom, this is the proof. This is the evidence that will put him in federal prison and get your house back. We have to wake Brianna up right now and show her what her husband has been doing." "No," Vivian hissed, lunging forward and slapping her hands flat on the mahogany desk. "No, you will not tell your sister. You will not breathe a word of this to Brianna. Do you understand me?" I looked at my father, expecting him to intervene to bring some sanity to the room. But Thomas simply lowered himself into the chair, his head bowed in defeat. He nodded slowly in agreement with my mother. "Your mother is right, Zoe," he mumbled, staring at the floor. "Brianna cannot know about this. It would destroy her." I stood up from the desk, the sheer audacity of their reaction pulling me to my feet. "Destroy her?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. "She is already destroyed. Her husband has a secret family. He stole $500,000 from you. He forged my signature on a federal loan. What do you mean she cannot know? She is living a lie." Vivian's face twisted into an ugly mask of desperate calculation. Her narcissistic obsession with social standing completely overrode her maternal instincts. "You do not understand how the world works, Zoe," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "Brianna is the envy of our entire congregation. She married a wealthy white venture capitalist. She lives in a beautiful home. She has a perfect image. If the church finds out that her husband is a broke thief who left her for a blonde woman 2 states away, the humiliation will be unbearable. So you want her to stay married to a man who is actively stealing from you?" I asked, completely staggered by her twisted logic. "You want to let him keep his mistress just so you do not have to face the embarrassment of a divorce?" "We will handle Connor privately," my father said, his voice weak and cowardly. "Once the bank issue is settled, I will speak to him man to man. We can force him to quietly end the affair. We can make him pay the money back over time. But if this becomes a public scandal, my reputation in the church will be ruined. I will be the pastor who let a white man swindle his congregation and cheat on his daughter. The deacons will force me to resign. We will lose everything." I looked at the 2 people who had raised me, and I felt a cold, dark void open up inside my chest. The last lingering thread of familial loyalty, the tiny microscopic part of me that still hoped they were capable of basic human decency, snapped and burned away into nothing. They were not just enablers. They were active co-conspirators in their own destruction. They would rather let a predator bleed their legacy dry than admit to their wealthy country club friends that they had been fooled. They would rather sacrifice their grandmother home than face a social scandal. And then Vivian delivered the ultimate unforgivable betrayal. She looked at me, her eyes hardening into cold, demanding slits. "That is why you have to sign the audit, Zoe. You have to use your CPA license to legitimize the missing funds. If you do not sign it, the federal investigators will come. They will find the offshore accounts. They will find the other family. The whole world will know. But if you sign it, the bank will back off. Connor will avoid prison, and we can keep this entire mess a secret." I stared at her, completely motionless. "You want me to take the fall?" I said, stating the fact plainly. "You want me to commit federal bank fraud, to risk losing my career and going to a federal penitentiary just so Brianna does not have to feel embarrassed at the country club? You want me to go to jail so Connor can keep his secret family?" Vivian did not even blink. "You are strong, Zoe," she said, her voice completely devoid of any motherly love. "You have always been the strong one. You are independent. You do not have a husband to embarrass or a congregation to lead. You can handle a federal inquiry. You can afford a good lawyer. Brianna is fragile. She cannot survive this. It is your duty as her older sister to protect her." The absolute monstrous nature of her request hung in the quiet study. She was asking me to lay my entire life on the sacrificial altar of her vanity. She was asking me to become a convicted felon to protect the illusion of a perfect family. In her mind, I was completely disposable. My freedom, my hard work, my business, my future with Elijah, none of it mattered. I existed solely to be the human shield for the golden child. I looked at my father. He refused to meet my eyes. He just stared at the Persian rug, silently endorsing my mother demand. He was a coward, a pathetic hollow man who preached about truth every Sunday, but lived in a fortress of lies. I took a deep breath. The anger, the betrayal, the hurt, all of it vanished. I did not feel sad. I did not feel the urge to cry. I felt completely and utterly liberated. For 35 years, I had desperately wanted their love. I had wanted them to see my worth. But looking at them now, I realized they were completely worthless. I was finally free from the toxic gravitational pull of their approval. I slowly reached out and picked up the iPad. I locked the screen, plunging the room back into the dim morning light. I looked at Vivian and then at Thomas. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting an image of total defeat. I forced my eyes to drop to the mahogany desk, mimicking the submission they had seen from me 1,000 times before. "You are right," I whispered, injecting just enough tremor into my voice to make it believable. "If the congregation finds out, it will destroy the family. Brianna would never recover." Vivian let out a massive sigh of relief, her posture immediately relaxing. She reached across the desk and briefly touched my hand, a fake gesture of maternal affection that made my skin crawl. "I knew you would understand, Zoe," she cooed. "You always do the right thing for the family." "I will handle the bank meeting tomorrow," I said, keeping my head bowed. "I will draft the documents today. Just keep Connor out of my way." Of course, my father agreed, his voice regaining a fraction of its usual pompous authority. "We will tell Connor to stay upstairs. You take all the time you need." I turned and walked toward the study door. I unlocked the brass latch and pulled the heavy oak door open. I did not look back at them. They thought they had won. They thought the scapegoat had finally accepted her place in the dirt. They believed I was going to spend the next 24 hours forging my own death warrant to protect their precious reputation. They had no idea that I was not walking out of that study to build a defense. I was walking out to build a guillotine. They wanted to protect the illusion so badly that they were willing to destroy me. But I was the architect now, and I was going to make sure that tomorrow morning, in front of the entire church board, the illusion would shatter so violently that none of them would ever recover. I walked straight out of the house, got into my car, and picked up my phone to call Elijah. It was time to set the final trap. I reached for the door handle of my car, but before I could pull it open, the heavy front door of the house swung wide. Connor and Brianna stepped out onto the porch and walked down the brick steps toward the driveway. They must have been waiting in the living room, listening for the study door to open. Connor walked with a relaxed, confident swagger that made my skin crawl. Brianna trailed just behind him, wiping the remnants of her tears away and replacing them with a cautious, hopeful expression. They had clearly spoken to my mother. They knew the Reverend and his wife had just ordered me to fall on my sword. I paused with my hand on the car door and took a slow breath. I needed to play this perfectly. For 35 years, I had been the scapegoat, the emotional punching bag they relied on whenever things went wrong. If I suddenly displayed too much confidence, they would panic and try to lock me out of the financial systems before the bank meeting. So I closed my eyes, reached into the deepest, most painful memories of my childhood, and pulled out the exact version of the broken daughter they expected to see. I turned around to face them, letting my shoulders slump forward. I lowered my gaze to the pavement and forced a single tear to well up and spill over my eyelashes. Connor stopped a few feet away from me, shoving his hands into the pockets of his designer slacks. He looked me up and down, taking in my defeated posture. A wide, sickeningly smug smile spread across his face. "Your mother tells me we have reached an understanding," Connor said, his tone dripping with patronizing authority. She said you are going to draft the audit and handle the bank representatives tomorrow morning. I kept my eyes on the ground and nodded slowly. I will do it, I whispered, injecting a slight tremble into my voice. I will sign the retroactive audit. I will take the professional risk. I just need to go back to my hotel to use their secure business network. The federal tax portals require encrypted internet connections to submit CPA-certified documents, and the router in the house is not secure enough. Brianna let out a massive, exaggerated sigh of relief. She practically ran across the driveway and threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a tight hug. The smell of her expensive floral perfume was suffocating. "Oh, Zoe. Thank you," she cried, squeezing me tightly. "I knew you would not let me go to federal prison. I knew you would do the right thing for our family. You are the best sister in the world." I stood perfectly rigid, enduring the physical contact. She was thanking me for protecting her while completely ignoring the fact that she was the one who had forged my name in the first place. She was thrilled that I was willing to sacrifice my entire career so she could continue living a lie. Connor stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, patting me exactly the way someone might pat an obedient dog. "Good girl, Zoe," he said, his voice thick with unearned triumph. "You are finally acting like a real sister. See, we are a team. Once you get this bank issue cleared up, I promise I will make it up to you. My startup is going to explode next quarter, and I will cut you in on the profits." I looked up at him through my fake tears. "I will have the paperwork ready for the board meeting tomorrow at 9, I said softly. "Perfect," Connor replied, giving my shoulder one last condescending squeeze. "We will see you at the church boardroom. Do not be late." I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I did not look back at them as I backed out of the driveway. I kept the mask of the terrified, defeated sister perfectly in place until I turned the corner and the house was completely out of sight. The moment I was alone in the quiet cabin of my car, the tears instantly vanished. My posture straightened, and the trembling in my hands was replaced by an icy, absolute calm. The false submission had worked flawlessly. They were back in their house celebrating their victory, completely unaware that they had just handed me the keys to their destruction. I connected my phone to the Bluetooth system and dialed Elijah. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything. I did not hold back a single detail. I told him about the forged signature. I told him about the secret mortgages on Big Mama House and the church. I told him about the second family in South Carolina, the blonde mistress, and the 2 secret children funded entirely by my family money. And finally, I told him about my parents. I explained how they had stared at the undeniable proof of Connor crimes and actively chosen to sacrifice my freedom just to avoid the social embarrassment of a public divorce. When I finished speaking, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy and dangerous. Elijah did not offer empty sympathies. He did not tell me he was sorry they had hurt me. He was a ruthless corporate attorney, and he recognized that this was no longer a family dispute. It was a war. "What are your orders, Zoe?" he asked, his voice dark and completely focused. "I am not going into that boardroom tomorrow to present a defense," I told him, navigating the dark streets toward my downtown hotel. "I am not going to sit across from those bank representatives and argue about loan terms. I want to own the room. I want to own the debt." I parked my car in the hotel garage and walked him through the strategy. Connor had used a predatory commercial lender specializing in high-risk bridge loans. These kinds of secondary financial institutions operated entirely on liquidity. When a massive loan went into default, they did not actually want to go through the lengthy, expensive process of foreclosure. They wanted cash. They regularly sold off their toxic, distressed debt to third-party collection agencies or private investment firms for pennies on the dollar just to clear it off their books. "I am the chief executive officer of a highly profitable forensic accounting firm," I reminded Elijah as I rode the elevator up to my suite. "I have millions in liquid corporate capital sitting in our treasury account. I want you to wake up your senior partners right now. I want you to contact the commercial lender holding the paper on the church and my grandmother house. Offer them an immediate cash buyout for the entirety of the defaulted promissory notes. Elijah let out a low, appreciative laugh, the legal brilliance of the move instantly clicking in his mind. You do not just want to expose them, he said. You want to become their landlord. Exactly, I said, unlocking my hotel door and walking inside. I do not want them answering to a faceless bank tomorrow. I want them answering to me. We stayed on the phone for the next 8 hours. While the rest of Atlanta slept, my hotel room transformed into a corporate command center. Elijah dragged 2 of his firm top contract lawyers out of bed in Chicago. By 2 in the morning, they had tracked down the vice president of distressed assets for the commercial lender Connor had used. At first, the executive was hesitant to authorize a late-night portfolio transfer, but Elijah was relentless. He pointed out the massive liabilities attached to the loans, including the forged signatures, which would tie the bank up in federal litigation for years. He offered them a clean, immediate exit. At 4 in the morning, the lender agreed to the terms. I opened my secure banking portal and authorized a massive wire transfer from my corporate treasury directly into the lender escrow account. I paid a premium to expedite the assignment of the debt, but it was worth every single penny. The money cleared at exactly 5:30 in the morning. By 6 o'clock, the legal documents arrived in my encrypted inbox. I printed them out on the small business center printer in the hotel lobby. I held the warm, crisp pages in my hands, reading over the legal jargon with immense satisfaction. A formal deed of assignment. It legally transferred every single right, title, and interest of the defaulted loans from the commercial bank directly to my private, limited liability company. I was now the sole legal owner of the mortgage on the family church. I was the sole legal owner of the mortgage on Big Mama House. If they missed a single payment, I had the absolute legal authority to evict them, seize the properties, and liquidate the assets. I owned their financial lives completely. I went back up to my room and took a long, hot shower, washing away the scent of my childhood home. I dried my hair and pulled on a sharp, pristine white designer suit. I wanted to look exactly like the powerful, unstoppable force I had become. I slid the printed deeds of assignment into a sleek leather portfolio, along with my iPad, which held the photos of Connor's second family. I checked my watch. It was 8:15 in the morning. My parents, Connor and Brianna, were probably getting dressed for the meeting, believing that their obedient scapegoat was about to walk into the church boardroom and save them from their own arrogance. They had no idea that the bank was no longer coming for them. I was. The drive to the church took less than 15 minutes. The parking lot was mostly empty except for the expensive cars belonging to the church board members and the sleek sedans of the bank representatives. I parked my rental vehicle, grabbed my leather portfolio, and walked through the heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary. The grand boardroom was located just down the hall from my father's private pastoral office. As I approached the room, I could hear the murmur of professional voices. I did not hesitate. I pushed the double doors open and stepped inside. The room was arranged for an execution. My father sat at the head of the long oak table wearing his most distinguished tailored suit. My mother Vivian and my sister Brianna sat to his right, looking like the perfect picture of a pious, supportive family. Brianna had even tied her hair back in a conservative style, playing the role of the stressed but faithful wife. On the left side of the table sat the 5 senior deacons of the church. These were the men who controlled the congregation, the men my parents desperately wanted to impress. At the far end of the table sat 2 local representatives from the commercial bank, looking impatient and wearing cheap gray suits. Connor was standing near the front of the room holding a laser pointer and a stack of blank folders. When he saw me walk in, his chest puffed out with sheer arrogance. He actually shot me a condescending wink. "Thank you all for being here this morning," Connor said, his voice smooth and dripping with fake humility. "I know there has been some confusion regarding the church reserve funds and the secondary loans. As a venture capitalist, I move large amounts of capital daily, and unfortunately, our former family accountant made a severe, catastrophic error in the tax coding. A collective murmur went through the deacons. They looked at me with varying degrees of disappointment and pity. My mother bowed her head, pretending to look ashamed of my actions. But Connor continued, placing a hand over his heart. We are a family of faith. We believe in forgiveness. My sister-in-law Zoe has returned from Chicago to formally present the corrected audit and claim full professional responsibility for the missing capital. We are prepared to hand over her sworn confession to the bank representatives today to clear the church of any wrongdoing. He gestured toward the front of the room, treating me like a performing monkey. The bank representatives crossed their arms, waiting for my presentation. My father gave me a stern, authoritative nod, silently commanding me to step up and destroy my own life. I walked to the front of the room. I did not carry a stack of papers. I did not look apologetic. I unzipped my leather portfolio, pulled out my iPad, and plugged the connection cable directly into the boardroom overhead projector. The massive screen behind me flickered to life. I am not here to present an audit, I said, my voice ringing out with absolute crystal clarity. I am here to show the board exactly why this church is in default. I tapped the screen. The projector displayed the high-resolution bank statements of Connor offshore accounts. The numbers were massive and highlighted in bright red. Last October, Connor authorized a wire transfer of $85,000 directly from the congregation tithing account, I announced, looking directly at the senior deacons. 2 months later, he drained another $120,000 from the building maintenance fund. He routed the money through 3 shell companies to a private account in the Cayman Islands. He is not a venture capitalist. He is a thief who used my father's pastoral authority to bleed this congregation dry. Total chaos erupted in the boardroom. The senior deacons gasped, pushing their chairs back and pointing at the screen. The bank representatives leaned forward, their eyes widening at the clear evidence of federal wire fraud. Connor's face turned the color of ash. He dropped his laser pointer and lunged toward the projector. "Turn that off!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "She is lying. She hacked my system and manipulated the data because she is jealous of my success. Do not listen to her." I did not back down. I simply swiped my finger across the iPad screen. The offshore bank statements disappeared, replaced instantly by the photograph of Connor standing on the porch in South Carolina. His arm was wrapped around the blonde woman, and the 2 young children were clinging to his legs. "He did not steal your money for a tech startup," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the shouting. "He stole your money to buy a 4-bedroom house for his mistress and his 2 secret children in Charleston. I have the property deed, the birth certificates, and the bank ledgers, proving every single cent of church money went to fund his second family." The sound that came out of Brianna's mouth was not human. It was a guttural, agonizing shriek that echoed off the boardroom walls. She leaped out of her chair, knocking it backward onto the floor. She stared at the massive photograph of her husband holding another woman baby. The illusion she had sacrificed my freedom to protect shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She grabbed a heavy glass water pitcher from the center of the table and hurled it directly at Connor. It missed his head and smashed against the wall, sending water and glass flying everywhere. My mother screamed, grabbing Brianna by the shoulders and trying to drag her out of the room. Vivian was not trying to comfort her daughter. She was frantically looking at the senior deacons, terrified of the public spectacle taking place in front of the church leadership. "Silence," my father bellowed, slamming both of his fists onto the oak table. He stood up, his face purple with rage, attempting to use his pastoral authority to regain control of the room. "Turn off that projector immediately, Zoe. This is a private family matter. We will handle this internally." I turned to look at the man who had ordered me to go to federal prison the night before. "You are not handling anything internally," I told him coldly. My father turned to the 2 bank representatives who were quickly packing their briefcases, clearly eager to distance themselves from the explosive fraud case. "Gentlemen, please," my father begged, his voice trembling. "Do not file the foreclosure paperwork today. We can restructure the debt. I will personally guarantee the repayment of the church loans. The bank representatives will not be filing any foreclosure paperwork today," I said, stepping away from the projector and opening my leather portfolio. The room suddenly fell quiet again. Even Brianna stopped screaming, sobbing violently into her hands instead. The bank representatives looked at me in confusion. I pulled the crisp printed documents from the portfolio and walked over to the bank agents. I handed them the paperwork. "You gentlemen can return to your local branch," I said smoothly. "If you check your corporate escrow accounts, you will see a massive wire transfer cleared at 5:30 this morning from my firm in Chicago. Your corporate vice president of distressed assets authorized the sale." The lead bank agent scanned the documents, his eyes darting across the legal seals and the signatures. He looked up at me completely stunned. "This is a legally binding deed of assignment," he muttered. "The parent company sold the debt." I turned to face my father, my mother Connor, and Brianna. They were staring at me completely paralyzed by the shifting power dynamic. "I bought the defaulted promissory notes," I announced, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the boardroom. "My private limited liability company is now the sole legal owner of the commercial loan attached to this church building. I also own the secondary balloon mortgage attached to Big Mama House." My father collapsed back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. Vivian covered her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond social embarrassment. Connor backed up against the wall, sliding down until he was practically sitting on the floor, staring at the undeniable proof of his ruined life. "You do not answer to the bank anymore," I told them, the absolute authority resting easily on my shoulders. "You answer to me. I am your landlord. I am your creditor. And my first official act as the owner of these properties is to issue an immediate notice of eviction. You have exactly 30 days to pack your things and vacate my buildings. If you leave a single piece of trash behind, I will have you forcibly removed by the county sheriff." I looked at the senior deacons, who were staring at me with a mixture of shock and profound respect. "The financial records are all on the secure server," I told them. "Hire an independent auditor to verify the theft and then call the police." I did not wait for a response. I closed my leather portfolio, picked up my iPad, and walked down the center aisle of the boardroom. I left them drowning in the ruins of their own making. I pushed the heavy double doors open and stepped out into the bright morning light, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. The heavy chains of my past were permanently broken. I had not just survived the fire they built for me. I had emerged as the absolute owner of the ashes. I pushed the heavy double doors open, but my exit from the church was immediately blocked. Elijah stood in the carpeted hallway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished floor. He was not alone. Standing right behind my brilliant fiancé were 3 federal investigators wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their backs. I stopped in my tracks and looked at Elijah. He smiled, handed me a cup of black coffee he had brought for me, and simply nodded. The trap we had set 48 hours ago in Chicago was finally snapping shut. I stepped aside, leaning against the hallway wall as the federal agent surged past me into the boardroom. The chaos that had just begun to settle inside erupted all over again, but this time it was completely out of my family control. I stood in the doorway sipping my coffee and watched the absolute destruction of Connor's carefully constructed facade. The lead agent called out Connor's full legal name, announcing in a booming voice that he was under federal arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Connor panicked. He tried to run toward the back exit of the boardroom, but an agent grabbed him by the collar of his expensive suit and slammed him violently against the heavy oak table. His hands were wrenched behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the room. Connor begged my father to do something, to call a lawyer and use his influence in the community. But the great Reverend Thomas just shrank back into his leather chair, a broken coward, watching his golden son-in-law get dragged away. Brianna was screaming hysterically, throwing herself at the federal agents and crying that there had been a mistake. The lead agent simply warned her to back away before she was charged with obstruction of justice. Elijah placed his hand gently on the small of my back, guiding me away from the noise and out of the church entirely. We flew back to Chicago that afternoon and let the federal justice system do its job. The fallout was spectacular, swift, and completely merciless. Because Connor had used stolen money to fund his entire life, the government seized absolutely everything. The federal prosecutors froze his shell companies and confiscated his luxury cars. The designer clothes, the joint bank accounts, and the expensive jewelry he had bought for Brianna were all seized as evidence of his crimes. Brianna was left utterly penniless. Without the stolen funds to maintain her country club lifestyle, she was quickly exiled by her wealthy socialite friends who wanted nothing to do with a federal scandal. Even the secret house in South Carolina was seized, leaving Connor's blonde mistress and her children out on the street. He had successfully ruined every single life he touched. The scandal ripped through the Atlanta congregation like wildfire. The church deacons held an emergency meeting the very next morning. They forced my father to resign immediately, stripping him of his pastoral title, his pension, and his parsonage. The social standing my mother had literally sacrificed my freedom to protect vanished overnight. They were disgraced, ostracized by the community, and completely broke. And true to my word, exactly 30 days later, the county sheriff deputies arrived at Big Mama House to execute the formal eviction notice my legal team had filed. My parents were physically escorted off the property they had allowed a thief to destroy. 6 weeks after the boardroom bloodbath, my receptionist buzzed my intercom. Her voice sounded hesitant when she told me my parents were standing in the lobby of my Chicago firm, asking for a few minutes of my time. I did not feel a spike of anxiety. I told her to send them back to my corner office. When the heavy glass doors swung open, I barely recognized the two people walking toward my desk. The arrogant pastor and the haughty Southern belle were completely gone. Thomas looked 10 years older, his shoulders slumped and his cheap suit hanging loosely on his frame. Vivian was not wearing her usual designer clothes or her perfect makeup. They looked exhausted, humbled, and utterly defeated by the world. They sat down in the leather chairs across from my desk, and for the first time in my entire life, they actually begged. My mother cried genuine tears, apologizing for being blind and asking me to forgive them for everything they had done. She said they had absolutely nowhere to go. She confessed that Brianna was sleeping on a friend couch and they were living out of their old sedan. They played the family card one last time, hoping my guilt would finally kick in and I would welcome them into my penthouse. I did not feel guilty. I looked at them and felt absolutely nothing. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a single manila envelope, sliding it across the glass surface toward them. My father opened it with trembling hands, pulling out a thick stack of papers. Inside was a 1-year lease for a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta. The rent and the basic utilities were prepaid for exactly 12 months. I told them this was my final act of daughterly duty. They had a roof over their heads for 1 year to figure out how to get jobs and support themselves. But the lease came with a strict ironclad condition. If they ever tried to contact me again, if they ever called my phone or showed up at my office, I would cancel the lease immediately and leave them on the street. They took the envelope without a single argument, completely stripped of their entitlement. They thanked me quietly, their voices thick with shame. I stood up, grabbed my tailored coat, and walked out of the office, leaving them sitting there in the silence of their new reality. Elijah was waiting for me by the elevators, holding my hand as we descended to the busy Chicago streets below. My sister had screamed at me to disappear, and my parents had demanded that I fold under their weight. But I did not disappear. I became the absolute architect of their reality. Thank you for watching my story to the very end. If you resonated with my journey of setting boundaries and taking back your power, please leave a comment below and let me know how you handled toxic family members in your own life. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about surviving betrayal and building your own empire. Remember that your worth is never defined by the people who failed to love you properly. Stay strong and keep building your beautiful life.